Chapter 8. By the time Alexander reached the boarding gate, his body had stopped reacting to pain and fear as separate things. They had blended into a dull, constant pressure beneath his skin, something he carried rather than felt. His shoulder throbbed faintly where it had been clipped during the chase, his knuckles scraped raw from gripping too hard, too long. He moved through the airport on instinct, passport out, boarding pass scanned. Doha was a stop, not a destination, a pause between one danger and the next. The aircraft was already half full when he stepped inside. The low lighting, muted voices, and the overall space made him feel sick. The familiar, anesthetizing hum of an enclosed system designed to keep people calm while carrying them thousands of miles away from their lives. Alexander found his seat by the window and sat down heavily, resting his forehead against the cool plastic for a moment before straightening. He had not slept properly in days. Every time his eyes closed, he saw Max's hand slipping from his, the courtroom dissolving into Almaty's streets, headlights bearing down on him. He told himself he would sleep once the plane was airborne, just for an hour. The seat beside him remained empty until the final boarding call. She arrived without urgency, placing her bag overhead with practiced ease, settling into the seat as if she belonged there. Alexander noticed her presence only because she did not fidget, did not rush, did not perform the small nervous rituals most passengers did. She glanced at him once briefly, then looked ahead. "Long flight ahead," she said after a moment, her tone neutral, almost thoughtful. "Yes," Alexander replied. She smiled faintly. "You look like someone who hasn't slept." He gave a non-committal nod. They sat in silence as the plane taxied. When it lifted off, the city lights dissolving beneath them, Alexander felt something in his chest loosen, not relief exactly, but distance. Space, the illusion of safety. "You're not traveling with your family," the woman said suddenly. Alexander turned his head slightly. "No," she tilted her head. "Business, something like that." She accepted this easily, then added, "Do you usually travel alone?" The question was casual but precise. Alexander hesitated, then answered honestly, "No." Her gaze lingered on him a second longer than necessary. "Where are they now?" He exhaled slowly. "My son is with his mother." "Ah," she paused. "Divorced?" "Yes." She nodded as if confirming a detail. "That's hard, especially when custody gets complicated." The word complicated landed heavier than it should have. Alexander shifted in his seat. "Are you a lawyer?" She smiled. "No." "Then you ask very specific questions." She didn't apologize. "Old habit, I work in risk assessment." He raised an eyebrow. "For different people, different governments, sometimes companies." She extended her hand. "Sarah Khalid." He shook it. "Alexander." She did not ask for his surname. Sarah Khalid never introduced herself the way people who wanted to be remembered did. Just a name placed lightly between sentences as if it were interchangeable. Alexander noticed that immediately. People like that rarely carried only one identity. She spoke with a neutral accent, English polished and untraceable, but there were moments when she paused, when she searched for a word she didn't need, or something older slipped through. "I consult," she had said earlier when he asked what she did, the kind of word that hid more than it revealed. She explained it in broad strokes: risk modeling, infrastructure analysis, advising firms on how to protect proprietary systems from exposure. Mostly engineers, she added. Brilliant ones, terrible at understanding how valuable they are. She said it with a faint smile, but her eyes stayed alert, assessing him even as she spoke. Alexander realized she wasn't watching his face as much as his silences, how long he took to answer, where he hesitated, which questions made him retreat inward. She was mapping him. Sarah's questions never came directly, she circled. She spoke about data breaches in Southeast Asia, about companies losing control of tools they thought were contained. She mentioned how certain governments no longer needed access to information, only leverage over the people who created it. "That's the modern battlefield," she said quietly. "Not war zones, workstations." Alexander responded cautiously, but fatigue made him less guarded than he should have been. He spoke about ethics, about responsibility, about how engineers often underestimated the political afterlife of their work. Sarah listened intently, nodding at the right moments, offering agreement without flattery. She never contradicted him, she didn't need to. She guided the conversation where she wanted it to go. It wasn't until later, much later, that he would understand how deliberate these questions had been. Sarah had spent years doing this. Raised in Saudi Arabia, educated across borders, trained to slip between cultures without friction. In the Bay Area, she posed as a consultant because consultants were trusted with secrets by default. She didn't steal data herself, she didn't hack, she listened. Engineers talked when they felt understood, when they felt admired, when they felt seen, and she did see Alexander. She saw the exhaustion clinging to him, the controlled anger. The grief he hadn't named out loud. She saw how carefully he avoided specifics, how tightly he held on to whatever it was he hadn't disclosed. That restraint intrigued her more than any confession could have. When she spoke of monetization, hypothetical and abstract, it wasn't an offer, it was a test. Some people would turn something like that into power, she said. Others would bury it and call that morality. She glanced at him. The world tends to punish the second type more harshly. Alexander didn't answer. He couldn't. The realization was settling in too fast. She wasn't guessing. She was confirming. He had revealed nothing concrete, yet she was already adjusting her assumptions upward. As the cabin settled into cruise, Sarah continued speaking, not continuously but in careful intervals. She asked about his work not broadly but with an unsettling focus. Whether he worked with centralized systems or distributed ones, whether his research dealt with prediction or storage. Whether he believed true privacy was still possible in the modern world. I think nothing is ever truly private, Alexander said cautiously. Unless it's designed that way, she replied smoothly, deliberately from the ground up. He felt his stomach tighten. People think power is about access, Sarah continued. But it's really about control over memory, who can store information, who can retrieve it, and who can erase the trail afterward. Alexander looked at her fully now. Why are you telling me this? Because you look like someone who understands systems, she said, and systems are only dangerous when the wrong people notice them. There it was. Alexander leaned back, suddenly alert. He realized he had mentioned too much already, his son, the custody, the urgency in his voice. He had allowed himself to appear fragile. Alexander said nothing next. Sarah smiled, unbothered, the silence stretched. He could feel the plane around them, the steady pressure, the sealed environment, the impossibility of leaving. I think I'm going to try to sleep, Alexander said finally. Of course, she replied, you've had a difficult week. That was when he knew with chilling certainty that this was not a coincidence. He stayed quiet afterwards. He slept in fragments. When the plane descended into Doha, Alexander felt more tired than before. Sarah stood before him, already collecting her bag. If you need anything while you're here, she said quietly, Qatar rewards people who know how to move discreetly. I won't be here long, he replied. She smiled again. Nobody ever plans to be. Then she was gone. Abzal's contact was waiting exactly where promised, a tall, broad and quiet man who asked no unnecessary questions. He was taken to a temporary apartment, small but warm enough, a sense of being held outside the noise. Later, alone in his temporary apartment, Alexander replayed the encounter with growing unease. Sarah hadn't threatened him, she hadn't pressured him. She hadn't asked for anything outright, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because people who needed nothing immediately were never finished. What Alexander didn't know, what he could not yet know, was that Sarah had broken one of her own rules with him. She had allowed sympathy to enter the equation. That interference would matter later. For now, she filed him away as both an asset and a variable, dangerous, valuable, and unresolved. And Alexander, unknowingly, had just stepped into a game where survival depended not only on intelligence, but on who decided to care. For 2 days, Alexander did nothing but rest, eat, and think, but distance brought clarity, not peace. On the third evening, his phone rang. Arian, Alexander answered immediately. Arian's voice came through low and tense, stripped of its usual ease. I'm not calling to scare you, he said, but things are shifting faster than we planned. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed tight to his ear, eyes fixed on the dark window. Arian explained that unusual questions had started circulating at the lab. No direct, confrontational questions, but systematic. Headquarters have been requesting for clarification on why certain test environments behaved differently, why logs appeared incomplete, why internal mirrors showed activity without corresponding entries in external audit tools. No one's accused us of anything, Arian said. That's what worries me, they're mapping the perimeter first. He told Alexander that 2 separate compliance teams had shown interest within days of each other, each claiming the inquiry came from a different oversight channel. That alone made it suspicious. This isn't a coincidence, Arian said carefully, and it's getting harder to keep deflecting without drawing attention. If you want this contained, you need to be present, or we need to shut things down in a way that won't look like panic. Alexander ended the call without answering right away. He stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly, replaying Sarah's voice on the plane, how easily she had spoken about systems, about invisible architecture, about power that didn't announce itself. Whatever was forming around him was no longer confined to one country or one problem. It was converging. He called Abzal next. I need to leave Qatar, Alexander said as soon as Abzal answered. His voice was steady but tight. Immediately, Abzal didn't press for details. He asked one question only. Are you in danger? Yes, Alexander replied after a brief pause. Not physical danger, not yet, but close enough. Not here, but soon. Abzal was silent for a moment. Then do what feels right, he said finally. Where? San Francisco. Abzal exhaled slowly. He warned Alexander that sudden movement would be noticed, that whoever was circling him would interpret it as confirmation of value. But staying still would be worse, Abzal added. If you're leaving, you do it cleanly. Alexander thanked him and ended the call, feeling the weight of what he hadn't said pressing harder than what he had. Abzal didn't know why he needed to go, only that he did. And for now, that separation between law and leverage, between truth and survival, was necessary. As Alexander opened his laptop to book the flight, he thought with unsettling clarity that whatever he was protecting no longer belonged only to him. He again thought of Max, of his life right now, of Sarah, of how many systems were now converging around him. As the confirmation email arrived, a single thought settled in his chest, heavy, inevitable, undeniable. This was no longer about custody. It seemed more than that, more threatening, more wild and more desperate, and he was standing at the center of something much larger than himself. Far above the city, planes lifted silently into the night, carrying secrets, fugitives, and people who did not yet know they were being hunted. Alexander leaned his head back against the bed and closed his eyes, but his mind refused to slow. Lumiere hovered there, not as code or equations, but as consequence. He had built it to solve a problem: how to move information without leaving it exposed, how to store truth without handing it over to systems designed to reshape it. He had never imagined how quickly that absence would become noticeable. The moment auditors began circling empty spaces instead of breaches, he knew something fundamental had shifted. Whatever he did next had to start with acknowledging one thing: Lumiere could no longer exist as it had before. He thought of the lab, the familiar hum of servers, the glass-walled offices that made secrecy difficult and invisibility impossible. If Lumiere stayed intact, if it remained elegant and whole, it would draw attention the way perfection always did. That meant breaking it deliberately. Fragmenting it into pieces that made sense only when held together by someone who understood the architecture intuitively. He would have to accept imperfection, delays, inefficiencies, compromises he once would have rejected outright. Sarah's voice returned uninvited, threading itself through his thoughts. The way she had spoken about invisibility, about power residing not in access but in control over memory. She hadn't asked him what Lumiere was, she had asked what kind of person would build something like it, that more than anything unsettled him. He realized now that as long as Lumiere was tied to him personally, his name, his reputation, his custody fight, it could be pulled apart using pressure rather than theft. The thought made his chest tighten. Whatever came next, he would have to step back, reduce himself in the equation, become less central, less visible. Arian's call replayed with uncomfortable clarity too. The problem wasn't that Lumiere had been discovered, it was that it had been noticed. Systems built to track everything had encountered something they couldn't account for, and that anomaly was now attracting attention from places that never announced themselves. Alexander imagined committees, quiet meetings, carefully worded inquiries that never touched content, only structure. He knew how those conversations went. He had been in them before. Once curiosity hardened into interest, it rarely softened again. If he waited too long, the choice would be taken from him. And beneath all of it, beneath the architecture, the strategy, the fear, was Max. Alexander felt that familiar ache spread through his chest, grounding him in something painfully simple. Whatever Lumiere became, whatever he sacrificed or protected, had to keep one thing intact: his ability to fight back without disappearing, not just for himself, but for his son. He understood now that this wasn't about control or recognition. It was about staying alive long enough to decide how and when to act. He had to return to think before the world closed in completely.